By the winter of 1966, Phuoc Toi province didn't look like the kind of place that would become a symbol. On a map, it was just another green smear on the southeastern edge of South Vietnam. Jungle, villages, rice paddies, rubber plantations laid out in neat man-made grids. But on the ground, it was a pressure cooker. The air itself felt heavy, like it had been boiled and poured back over the land. Every track vanished into trees. Every tree could hide a rifle. Every quiet stretch of road carried the same question. Is the silence real, or is it waiting? Australia's commitment to the war had a heart, and that heart sat on a low rise at Nui Dat. Nui Dat wasn't built like the big American bases. Those loud, sprawling cities of sandbags and floodlights, helicopters clattering overhead day and night, convoys rolling like armored rivers. Nui Dat was different, smaller, tighter, deliberate. The Australians weren't trying to win by being everywhere at once. Their philosophy was colder and in many ways more suffocating to the enemy, dominance through presence. They carved a 5-kilometer exclusion zone around their perimeter, cleared it, watched it, punished it. Then they did what the Viet Cong hated most. They waited in the right places and moved like they owned the darkness. Long-range patrols slipped out, ambushes folded into tree lines, recon teams walked miles just to lie perfectly still for hours, listening to the jungle breathe. Supply lines that had been used for years, trusted routes, familiar trails, started to feel cursed. VC couriers vanished. Small units tried to move at night and found themselves staring into the quiet muzzle flashes of an unseen line. The locals whispered about Australians the way people whisper about storms, not angry, not loud, just inevitable. To the regional communist command, the Australians weren't merely a nuisance. They were a thorn that would not stop scraping at the skin. American search and destroy missions could be massive, dramatic, and often predictable. You heard them coming. You could slip away from their noise. But the Australians had a professional lethality that didn't announce itself. Their patrols didn't roar. They appeared. And for the VC, that was worse. By August 1966, the decision hardened into something like a vow. Nui Dat had to be neutralized. The 1st Australian Task Force had to be humiliated, not just attacked, broken publicly, so the province would breathe again. The plan that formed was ambitious, and it carried the confidence of commanders who believed they finally understood their enemy. A well-equipped main force unit, the VC 275th Regiment, began to concentrate in the shadows, reinforced by local guerrilla battalions who knew every creek and hedgerow. They gathered men and weapons with the patience of hunters building a trap, and the chosen killing ground was a place that looked harmless from a distance, the Long Tan Rubber Plantation. A plantation is order imposed on nature, rows in straight lines, trees like columns, clean ground, perfect symmetry, and that kind of order in war can become a corridor straight into hell. Their strategy began in the early hours of August 17th. At approximately 2:43 a.m., Nui Dat's uneasy silence cracked open. It started as a distant cough, then a tearing roar, then the night sky itself seemed to throw metal down onto the base. Mortar rounds, recoilless rifle fire, artillery shells, more than 80 impacts pounded the Australian positions. Dirt and smoke erupted. The concussion rolled through the trenches like a wave. Men stumbled half awake into chaos, hands searching for helmets and weapons, adrenaline turning everything sharp and bright and unreal. When it ended, 24 Australians were wounded, but the VC didn't fire that barrage to win the night. They fired it as bait. They knew the Australians had doctrine, they knew the Australians had pride, and they knew that an artillery or mortar attack would trigger an immediate response. Counter-battery fire, then tracking patrols, fast, disciplined, determined, to locate the firing sites before the enemy could pack up and disappear. The VC commanders expected the Australians to come looking, and they had prepared a field to receive them. The morning of August 18th arrived hot and wet, with that particular monsoon humidity that clung to the skin like a second uniform. Delta Company of 6 RAR, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, was ordered out. Major Harry Smith led them. Smith was tough in the way men become tough when they've been tested and decided the testing won't change them. A former paratrooper, disciplined, blunt, respected. He didn't waste words, he didn't dramatize, he expected his men to move like professionals, and in return he carried their lives like a responsibility that never left his shoulders. Delta Company was 108 men. They were told it was routine. Locate the mortar firing points, confirm tracks, maybe make contact with stragglers, then back. The sort of job that left soldiers more irritated than afraid. As they checked webbing, tightened straps, and shouldered rifles, the mood was steady, focused, slightly bored, joking in low voices. None of them understood they were stepping toward the center of a pincer movement built by over 2,500 veteran enemy troops. The stage was set for the most defining encounter in Australian military history, though at the time it felt like just another damp morning in Vietnam. At around 11 a.m., Delta Company marched out of Nui Dat's perimeter, replacing Bravo Company, which had spent the night tracking mortar crews with nothing to show but sweat and frustration. The world beyond the wire was a green maze. The scrub thickened, then thinned, then opened into the plantation, and the plantation felt wrong. Rubber trees stood in haunting symmetrical rows, stretching in lines that made the eye believe in clarity. Visibility was clean straight ahead, but diagonal sight lines were deceptive, broken by trunks and shadows. It was like walking inside a cathedral built from repeating columns. The ground was relatively clear, bare red dirt, but overhead the canopy knitted into a tight emerald ceiling. For hours, the patrol moved with practiced precision. Platoons fanned out, 10, 11, 12, standard formation. Men scanned, listened, adjusted spacing. spacing. They found evidence, discarded mortar base plates, tracks indicating a hurried withdrawal, confirmation that the mortar crews had been there and had slipped away. It should have been a neat conclusion, but the deeper they pushed, the more the quiet began to feel unnatural. Not peaceful, but deliberate, like a held breath. At 3:40 p.m., that held breath snapped. 11 Platoon, led by 2nd Lieutenant Gordon Sharp, a young officer with charisma and a calm that made men trust him, spotted a small group of enemy soldiers in khaki, not local guerrillas. These men moved with the discipline of regulars. Sharp's men engaged. The enemy fired back, then began to fall away into the plantation, retreating just fast enough to stay visible, just slow enough to invite pursuit. And because the Australians had a doctrine of aggressive follow-up, because letting the enemy slip away felt like letting them win, 11 Platoon chased. They didn't know they were being walked into a horseshoe-shaped ambush. The first heavy exchange erupted, and almost on cue, the sky turned the color of a bruise. In minutes, the monsoon opened like a slammed door. Rain poured down in thick sheets, hammering the rubber leaves with the sound of 1,000 drums. The plantation transformed. Red dust became red sludge. Visibility collapsed. Mist rose from the ground and mixed with the downpour until the world turned gray-green and close and confused. Voices vanished in the roar of water. Orders had to be screamed. Radios crackled with static, words eaten by storm. Then came the message. Sharp, urgent, slicing through the chaos. Contact front. 11 Platoon had run into the main force of the VC 275th Regiment. Not skirmishers, not scattered guerrillas. Hundreds of enemy soldiers began to emerge from the mist, moving not as a few men testing the line, but as a mass surging forward in waves. In that instant, Delta Company stopped being a patrol and became a cornered animal. Major Harry Smith heard the crescendo of machine gun fire and understood immediately. The routine sweep had evaporated. There would be no neat track back to base, no simple report. There was only survival, in the heart of Long Tan, surrounded, drenched, and cut off from the wire. As the monsoon turned the plantation into a blurred, shaking world, the scale of the disaster became terrifyingly clear. 11 Platoon was pinned on a slight rise and taking a frontal assault of staggering size. Khaki-clad infantry, battle-hardened regulars of the 275th and the D-445 Battalion pushed forward with a discipline that felt endless. Bugles and whistles shrieked through the storm, signals for charges that rolled forward like tides. The numbers were later confirmed. 108 Australians facing roughly 2,500 enemy combatants, more than 20 to 1. Men lay prone in the mud, cheek pressed into wet earth, firing SLR rifles in steady, desperate rhythm. Every time a wave fell, another rose from the gray curtain. Sharp was killed while trying to direct fire. One moment a voice, the next a body in the mud. Command snapped downward to Sergeant Bob Buick, who gathered what he could into a shrinking perimeter of wounded and exhausted men. Radio messages began to sound like nightmares. They're everywhere. They're crawling out of the ground. Smith faced an agonizing decision that every infantry commander fears. Retreating would abandon 11 Platoon to slaughter. Moving to support them risked exposing the entire company in open lines between tree rows, lines the VC had already measured with guns. Enemy heavy machine guns and recoilless rifles joined the fight. Rubber trunks exploded into splinters. Wooden shards became shrapnel. The plantation, once orderly, began to look like a place being torn apart by invisible hands. And the VC did something tactically cruel. They tried to hug the Australians, closing distance so tightly the Australians couldn't call in airstrikes or artillery without risking their own men. At that moment, 108 soldiers stood on the edge of being erased, out of sight of their base, drenched to the bone, facing an enemy determined to make Long Tan the site of Australia's greatest defeat. But while Delta Company fought for every inch of mud, the true turning point sat kilometers behind them at Nui Dat. In the roaring storm, Major Smith made the call that would define the battle. He requested danger-close artillery fire. It was a gamble with teeth. It meant raining high explosive shells down just meters from his own perimeter. It meant trusting gunners who couldn't see the target. It meant trusting mathematics and discipline over fear. The responsibility fell on 161 Battery, Royal New Zealand Artillery, and the Australian 103 and 105 field batteries. At Nui Dat, the gun pits were a nightmare of water and mud. Rain came so hard, men used slouch hats to cover fuses and keep them dry. Shells were hauled and loaded in a relentless rhythm, hands slick, boots sinking, voices reduced to short commands. And in the heart of the killing zone, Captain Maurice Stanley, the forward observation officer, became the calm voice in the storm. While bullets snapped and men screamed and radios hissed, Stanley performed calculations with icy precision. He wasn't simply calling for fire, he was building a moving wall of steel around Delta Company's shrinking circle. 24 howitzers fired more than 3,000 rounds during the encounter. The shells burst above ground or detonated against rubber trunks, sending white-hot fragments through enemy formations. When the VC gathered for charges, the artillery punished them with brutal surgical accuracy. And when the enemy tried to close in to avoid the bombardment, Stanley adjusted, closer still, sometimes within 30 to 50 meters of Australian positions. The ground shook hard enough to rattle teeth. The air filled with cordite and pulverized wood. Men crouched in scrapes and felt shock waves roll through their bones. A soldier from 11 Platoon would later whisper the simplest prayer of that day: "The guns, thank God for the guns." It wasn't luck, it was training. Years of Anzac combined arms discipline turned into muscle memory. Without that precise, relentless curtain of fire, Delta Company would have been overrun in the first hour. But artillery, even perfect artillery, can't solve one problem: ammunition. By around 6 p.m., Delta Company was reaching a breaking point. The shield held, but the men behind it were burning through magazines at an alarming rate. Some were down to their last rounds. Others scavenged ammo from fallen mates with hands that shook from cold and exhaustion. Major Smith sent a radio message that carried desperation beneath its clipped professionalism: "Ammunition low. Request emergency resupply. Drop it on my smoke." In normal conditions, it would have been considered impossible. The monsoon had intensified into a white wall. Cloud base dropped low. Lightning stabbed the sky so often it felt like the storm was trying to tear itself open. Enemy machine guns waited for anything that dared fly slow and low. And yet, 2 RAF pilots volunteered: Flight Lieutenant Frank Riley and Flight Lieutenant Bob Grandin. They lifted UH-1 Iroquois Huey helicopters into the storm and flew on instruments through turbulence that shoved and slapped the aircraft like a living thing. They hugged the treetops, rotors clipping leaves, eyes straining through a world of rain. They couldn't see the ground until they were almost on top of it. Then, through the mist, red smoke. Below them, a small circle of exhausted men in a sea of gray-green chaos. The VC realized what was happening and turned their guns upward. Traces cut through rain, the cockpit filled with the metallic smell of wet air and fuel and fear. The Hueys couldn't land. There was no time. Crewmen, soaked and straining, shoved heavy wooden crates, 7.62mm ammunition, bandages, out the doors into the mud. Crates hit the ground and burst open. Soldiers scrambled under fire, tearing lids apart with bayonets and bare hands, passing magazines down the line like lifelines. For Delta Company, it was more than supplies. It was proof. They weren't forgotten. One veteran would later say seeing those Hueys in that weather felt like watching the cavalry ride through a nightmare. It sparked a second wind in men who had been running on fumes. The battle then fractured into dozens of brutal small struggles. And in those struggles, something uniquely Australian became the engine of survival. Mateship, not a slogan, not a romantic idea. A stubborn, unbreakable commitment to the man beside you. At Long Tan, it stopped being culture and became mechanics. The thing that held the unit together when everything else tried to pull it apart. 11 Platoon had suffered the heaviest casualties. Wounded men lay trapped in no man's land, where VC snipers and machine gunners targeted anything that moved. Rain pooled in shell holes, mud clung to bodies. The wounded couldn't crawl, the uninjured couldn't stand up, and still, soldiers went out for their mates. Private Barry Acker Miller was hit and stranded. Under a hail of bullets, men crawled from shallow scrapes and dragged him back, using their own bodies as shields. The scene repeated again and again, men risking their lives not for medals, but because leaving someone out there simply wasn't an option. Medics worked in the open, hands numb from cold, shaking not from fear but from the sheer intensity of what they were trying to stop. With no time, no proper cover, sometimes no morphine, they did battlefield miracles, plugging wounds with ration wrappers, applying pressure with whatever they had, while their own artillery screamed overhead. When 12 Platoon attempted to reach the battered 11, they moved through crossfire that would have broken less disciplined units. They didn't move as individuals chasing glory. They moved like a single organism, driven by a desperate need to save brothers. In one moment, a soldier whose rifle jammed stood up in the middle of a VC charge and swung the weapon like a club to protect a wounded friend until covering fire arrived. It wasn't polished heroism, it was raw loyalty in mud and thunder. The VC commanders expected a unit facing 20-to-1 odds to shatter. Men should break, men should run. Instead, the Australians huddled tighter, fought harder, and held their line with a ferocity that stunned the attackers. By refusing to abandon the wounded, Delta Company maintained an unbreakable front that human waves couldn't penetrate. As light began to fail, the enemy bugles sounded again through the rain, a final signal. The VC massed for one last decisive assault before nightfall. If they could overrun the perimeter before darkness, they could finish the job, wipe Delta Company out, seize weapons, carry the story like a trophy. Men in Delta Company prepared for a last stand with faces slick with rain and mud, eyes wide, lips pale, hands tight on rifles. Then a new sound began to rise, deeper than thunder, heavier than gunfire, a mechanical rumble, steel moving through jungle. The relief force was coming. A squadron of armored personnel carriers, 10M113 APCS, led by 2nd Lieutenant Adrian Roberts, had fought its own battle just to reach the plantation. Flooded creeks had swollen into barriers. Jungle resisted every turn. Enemy fire probed at them from the edges. They had even had to swim their amphibious vehicles across a rain-swollen creek, engines roaring, water spilling over armor, men inside gripping handholds and praying the tracks would find purchase. As they neared Long Tan, they encountered a large flank of VC troops, nearly a battalion, positioned to move in and finish Delta Company. The APCs didn't hesitate. Their .50 caliber machine guns opened up, ripping through the rain with a harsh, stuttering fury. The vehicles tore forward through rubber trees, smashing symmetry into splinters, grinding mud under heavy tracks. The VC had no heavy anti-tank weapons ready. Caught in the open, they scattered and fell. Some tried grenades, some tried to run, some tried to fight steel with bravery. Steel doesn't care. The APCs broke through the last line of trees and into Delta Company's perimeter like something out of a fever dream. Dark silhouettes, boxy and unstoppable, appearing through mist just as the infantry had been bracing for the final charge. One survivor would later say it was the most beautiful sight he'd ever seen. Those steel boxes coming through the rain. The APCs formed a defensive ring. Their guns added firepower the VC couldn't match. Surprise, the enemy's greatest weapon was gone. The Australians were no longer an isolated circle of exhausted men. They were now the center of an armored counterattack. VC whistles finally signaled retreat. Under falling darkness and persistent rain, thousands of enemy troops melted back into the jungle as if the plantation itself swallowed them. The silence afterward was heavy, almost painful. The storm still hissed, but the gunfire had vanished. Men looked around like they had just woken from something unreal. The relief had arrived at the last possible moment, 10 minutes later, and Long Tan might have ended as a massacre. Instead, the breakthrough at dusk ended the onslaught and lit the first flame of a legend. When the sun rose over the Long Tan Rubber Plantation on August 19th, it revealed devastation arranged in rows. Splintered trunks, charred scars, red earth churned into a graveyard of mud, shell craters filled with rainwater. The plantation, once orderly, now looked like it had been punched and ripped apart by unseen giants. As Australians moved cautiously through mist to clear the battlefield, the scale of what they had survived became brutally clear. They found 245 enemy bodies scattered across the plantation, with evidence suggesting hundreds more had been carried away during the night. For Australia, the cost was heavy. 18 men killed, 17 from Delta Company, 1 from the APC squadron, 24 wounded. It was the highest number of casualties the Australian army would suffer in a single engagement during the Vietnam War, and yet those 108 men had done what should not have been possible. They had stood against a force 20 times their size and refused to be erased. The Battle of Long Tan didn't just become a victory, it became a reputation. In the eyes of American commanders, the Australians were no longer a small Commonwealth contingent. They were recognized as a premier jungle fighting force. Disciplined, precise, relentless. General William Westmoreland visited the survivors and offered congratulations, acknowledging that their discipline and combined arms coordination had prevented a strategic humiliation in Phuoc Tuy. More importantly, the battle marked the enemy. After Long Tan, VC and North Vietnamese regulars treated the Australian exclusion zone with a new dread. They began to speak of Australians differently, less as foreign troops and more as something that lived in the province like a curse. Ghosts of the jungle. Not because Australians were invisible, but because they didn't behave like the enemy expected. They didn't panic, they didn't waste ammunition, they didn't abandon their wounded, they didn't fold under numbers. Long Tan proved that an Australian platoon could fight like a company, and an Australian company could hold off a regiment, if it held together, if it trusted its training, if it kept faith with the man beside it. Today, Long Tan is more than a date, it's a standard, a spiritual anchor in the modern Australian army, a reminder that professional excellence isn't a slogan and mateship isn't sentiment. Under the worst conditions imaginable, they become the difference between being overrun and being remembered. The Anzac spirit that had lived at Gallipoli and Tobruk found new proof in a rain-soaked rubber plantation. The 108 men of Delta Company walked into Long Tan as ordinary soldiers on a routine patrol. They walked out as something else entirely, men whose stubborn refusal to break turned a trap into a legend. And whenever the Australian flag is carried into conflict, the world still remembers the day 108 stood against 2,500 in the pouring rain and the jungle ghosts were born.